Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that is an extremely difficult act to follow. But on a very serious side, John, thank you for your testimony. Can you give me your definition, your personal definition of a high-hazard, unsafe dam?
Well, it's one of our dams. We have about 60 lakes across the state that our engineers inspect on a routine basis to make sure they stay safe. And if they start showing signs of leakage or erosion in an emergency spillway, they watch that and they consult with DEP, who permits our dams, to determine how safe or unsafe they may be. And when those dams become in a condition where the engineers say they're unsafe and they're high hazard, and there's this unsafe condition depends upon how many people live downstream that could be damaged if the dam would fail. So if nobody lives downstream, they would only be a high hazard dam, not an unsafe high hazard dam. So we have high hazard dams, unsafe high hazard dams, and safe dams. So they move into the various categories based upon our engineering inspections. Okay.
So the new regulations that came out from DEP a couple of years ago, we'll say, I don't know exactly when, that said that our dams now need to be able to withhold 16 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. I think that was something that has caused a lot of us to have dams, both public and private, in our communities, to a lot of grief, so to speak. I know especially up in the Pocono area where they have many dams that we're finding that water levels are being lowered below dock levels and things like that. So these dams that you're talking about when you say high hazard, unsafe dams, that still doesn't include what you might have to do to meet this new regulation that, frankly, a lot of us think is way out of bounds to raise the level of the spillway and the dam itself. Am I getting that correct? So we might be looking at not just repairing dams for leaks and erosion. We might be talking about reconstruction as well.
If capacity right now is a factor that the engineers use, the capacity factor that you just cited, I'm not sure if that's in play right now or if that's going to come into play in the future. But that's one of the safety standards that the engineers use to determine whether or not it goes on the list.
I've got, just for knowledge sake here, I've got 2 dams in my district that have already received the letters from DEP saying you will engineer this and you will rebuild this to meet these new specs. Now the dams get inspected every single year, and usually DEP actually even sends somebody out to walk across the breast and say, yeah, I don't see any water flowing out the sides. But you know, they've already instituted this as far as I'm concerned. They've already said, you're going to do this and you better get started with your engineering. And if you don't, we'll drain your dam. Have you not gotten any of those letters on any of your dams in Pennsylvania?
Well, my engineers work very closely with DEP engineers, so I'm sure that we're seeing the same thing that you're seeing relative to what the requirements will be. Our dams are no different than the dams that you have. So I can't say specifically about the criteria that you just mentioned, but I'm sure we're getting the same message that you are.
So the point that I'm making, unfortunately, is that even though you go in and repair these dams for erosion and leakage and so forth, there might be a whole lot more money needed for these dams if DEP gets their way, which is something I'd desperately like to stop, by the way. I think it's ludicrous that they've gone to this point, but there could be a much larger need for funding for these dams than what we're talking about as far as just being high hazard and unsafe. So just throwing that out there. Changing directions a little bit, and I'm going to go back to something I've questioned for quite some time. And in your report, it said that after, or in the fall, I guess, it's catch and release only for trout, okay? But Didn't we determine some time ago that trout have a very difficult time wintering over in our streams?
Yeah, that's why we allow harvest after June 15th in those delayed harvest areas. It's only catch and release for the period of time when the streams stay cold, and anglers can catch them and release them, and other anglers can catch them.
Okay.
And when we forecast it gets too cold or too warm after June 15th, anglers can keep them.
Okay.
Okay.
But bass can winter over much better than the trout, correct?
Yeah, well, the catch and release for bass, I thought you meant the
Right,
Keystone
I'm trying
Select.
to tie two things
Yeah, the
together here.
catch and release for bass was designed to protect the older bass, so that until the population recovered, and it hasn't recovered yet, it's getting better, but it hasn't recovered yet, until the population recovers, we felt that that's all the Fish and Boat Commission can do to protect the bass in the river, was to put catch and release on
In
it.
small streams, can bass and trout coexist?
They can.
So since they can winter over much better than the trout, and you've heard me preach this before, how comes we don't stock some fingerling bass along with the trout?
Well, and I've told you this before.
I know.
Whenever bass can reproduce in areas that are suitable for bass to reproduce. For us to be able to raise sufficient numbers of bass to make a difference at a population level, we can't stock big bass because they're just too expensive to stock to create recreation like we do with trout. So we'd have to stock little bass like we do with walleye and muskie and put them out at like high rates to be able to try to make any difference. Literally, we'd have to stock millions of bass in the Susquehanna River, and they would be subjected to the same conditions that the bass that are naturally reproduced in the river are subjected to. So they would start getting sores and lesions on them just like the fish that are born in nature. So stocking bass is really not a solution to the problems of the Susquehanna.
But what about small streams?
Well, even in smaller streams, it's cost prohibitive to be able to raise, grow, and stock sufficient numbers of bass to be able to make a difference even on small streams.
Okay, my thought process was that a large majority of them that weren't caught and taken out would winter over and grow into being larger fish the next year. But
yeah, most streams that support naturally reproducing fisheries, like bass, reach a carrying capacity. It's like you can only fit so many fish in a barrel, and they start coming out of the barrel. Well, the environmental conditions really control how many bass or other native fish a stream can support. When it reaches that capacity, no matter how many fish we put in, it's still only going to support that number of fish.
okay, I take that as we don't want to go down that bass road again.
Thanks for reading between the lines.
I've already got a button. Actually, a couple of them had. Wage positions, you went from 119 to 50. What is a wage? Are you talking like deputies that work by the hour?
No, these would be like seasonal positions that we use to supplement permanent staff in like hatcheries and in other programs.
Okay.
We have seasonal clerical staff that help us during periods of peak workflow. So those are the positions that we were talking about.
And we sorely need those positions back?
We do, because it takes some of the burden off the permanent staff to allow them to do other things that they should be doing.
Okay, I'm building a case for back home as to why we need to vote. As Mr. Mullery said, we need to explain this to our constituents back home as to why we need to do what we're going to do.
Yeah, we're about as lean and mean as we can get. You can imagine going from 432 to 376, what that does. And we haven't cut a trout. We still raise and stock 3.2 million, over 10 million warm and cool water species. We're down in law enforcement only because we can't run a school. We just had a school last year. We had 25 vacancies going into the school last year. We've got 10 vacancies going right now in terms of district officers. So we just can't keep doing everything with the limited amount of staff that we have.
Okay, I'll make this my last question. You've heard before I even ask the question, are all the employees of the Fish Commission part of SERS?
Yes.
Okay. So obviously, everyone in Pennsylvania that listens to any news at all knows that the pension system is something that needs to be addressed. If we were to, have you guys done a study that if we were to go to a defined contribution system, a 401k or something similar, what savings would you recognize in years to come Has anybody done a study in the Fish and Boat Commission about that? And that would only be for, and I can't stress enough, new employees.
Yeah, I don't think the results would be any different for us than what the forecasts are for the state government as a whole. So we rely on those projections. Since there's just so many alternatives out there about what direction we can go in, we haven't done an independent study of our own because, first of all, we don't have a vote in what happens. We're just told what happens. And we just apply or adhere to the rules of government that we're given. But we have not done a specific study of our own about, what would happen if we changed the pension plan.
Do you know?
I hazard to say this, but I talk about why we need a license fee to have angler and boaters support the programs we have. But on the other side of the ledger, if we cut expenses, if you would find a solution to cover the Fish and Boat Commission's pension fees, pension obligations, that would allow us then not to have a license increase to the level that we're proposing.
Right. I don't think there's anything immediate because the obligations are the obligations. I'm looking down the road 10, 15, 20 years. Mm-hmm. So that's when it would really you'd start to realize that savings. Would you and or the commissioners be in favor of this type of pension reform since it would affect you?
Absolutely. It'd save us money.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.